I'm going to do this down here where there is some light because my eyes are not as young as they used to be. Well, Professor Caryn Aviv is the post-lecturer in secular Jewish culture at the University of Denver Center for Judaic Studies and academic director of the certificate in Jewish Communal Service at the university's Graduate School of Social Work. She also serves as director of research with Jewish Mosaic, the National Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity.
Can't hear you.
Yeah. I will hold it closer. Would you like me to start again?
No.
No. All right. Then I'll do it in French. As a sociologist, Caryn writes and teaches in the areas of contemporary Jewish identities, sexualities, and Israel studies. She has co-written and co-edited 3 books, including Queer Jews and New Jews and the Diaspora, which are on the book table. And is currently working on a book project that examines the role of American Jews in Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation efforts. And Caryn lived in Israel, so that's quite a bit of interest in that area, for several years researching her dissertation on gender, American Jewish immigration there, and citizenship. She also started working with the ritual theater group Storytelling, which you have to check out the website of. It's pretty amazing. It is really rocking. Storytelling.org. And shared with me her desire to someday be a rabbi. And of course, I suspect we'll have the opportunity to explore that and so many other interesting subjects where we have common interest this weekend. Caryn co-parents her 4-year-old daughter with a gay couple, David Schneer and Greg Drinkwater. David is Caryn's writing co-conspirator and colleague. He directs the University of Denver Center for Judaic Studies. Okay. Other Jewish studies program there now. And Greg is David's husband and Caryn's colleague in his work as executive director of Jewish Mosaic. Now, of course, our movement has long been inviting and welcoming to queer people, as many of you know, both because one of our founders, Rabbi Sherwin Wine, was a gay man, and because our progressive humanistic values commit us to equality for all people. Yet I must also say that as an out bisexual man myself, it is a thrill to have you with us, Caryn, to talk about these issues with us and help us to all contemplate and act upon the fabulous diversity of humanity that forms and informs our Jewish paths as well. So Caryn, thank you for joining us for this weekend. It's been a very stimulating one, and I know it's going to get better yet as we go. And now we're all looking forward to hearing your talk entitled The New Jewish Diversity. Let's have a warm welcome for
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to dump over here so that I can get out of the way. So I want to thank Adam, actually, for inviting me. Adam and I met last winter, I think. It was a really wonderful meeting and lots of ideas exchanged, and so that's why I'm here today. And I want to thank all of you for coming and for engaging with really interesting, intellectually challenging ideas, and I'm sure that some of the things that I talk about today will hopefully provoke and stimulate more ideas, possibly some controversy. Don't throw tomatoes at me. That would really not be okay. So I'm going to kind of like this. Let's see what time it is so I don't vote for the minute. Good. So I want to start with a quote by a really famous, awesome Jewish historian named Simon Rodinowitz, who was writing mid-century, writing during the Holocaust and the birth of the State of Israel. I'll just read this very quickly. He or she, who studies Jewish history will readily discover that there is hardly a generation in the diaspora that did not consider itself the final link in Israel's chain. And when he talks about Israel, he's actually meaning the people of Israel. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. So he's talking about the people of Israel globally. He's not talking about the state of Israel. Each saw before it the abyss ready to swallow it up. Each generation grieved not only for itself, but also for the great past that was going to disappear forever. Wow, we have a lot of death talk today. As well as for the future of unborn generations who would never see the light of day. It's a pretty dark quote, but actually when I first came across this in graduate school about 15 years ago, I thought, oh my gosh, she's channeling my grandmother. And this is what my grandmother used to do.
We're all gonna die if we don't remain Jewish. Don't marry a non-Jew.
That's Naomi, my grandmother. And the reason why I chose this quote to open today's talk is because I often hear variations on this quote and my grandmother about the same questions about is the Jewish glass half full or half empty? And I hear the hauntedness of existential anxiety that is particularly Jewish in those kinds of questions. Are we on the verge of this existential crisis of dying out 20 years from now? Or are we possibly reinventing ourselves in new and different and exciting ways? Half full, half empty, it really depends. And I think actually the more I do research on contemporary Jewish communities and contemporary Jewish identity, that the stories that we tell, like the story that Simon is alluding to, or I think he's possibly critiquing, they are anxiety stories that are recycled, that don't serve us necessarily, and they don't necessarily reflect reality of how we live our lives as Jews. So what I want to suggest by showing you a lot of synthesized data is that I think Jewish communities are always at some sort of crossroads, and they're always facing new challenges, and I think that's simply a condition of post-modernity in a secular age. And it's also a reflection of Jewish resilience and Jewish creativity and adaptation to new and changing circumstances. So, and I'll talk about my own cards on the table in a second about why I think that. So what I want to talk about today is both descriptive and proscriptive, and like Jacques talked about last night, hopefully provocative. And I want to open with an argument about what does it mean to have a diverse Jewish community? What does that actually look like? And we'll talk about the composition of this room in a second to look at ourselves. And then what I want to do is actually describe some of the ways that Jews are already diverse, and that's why I opened up this with new in question mark and parentheses, new Jewish diversity. I don't think there's anything new, I just think that people are doing diversity in different ways.
Tell you the way you do this.
It's all right, you've already read it. I'm standing here. How's that? Great.
Or wait here. It's over there.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
There's nothing new about Jewish pushiness.
I love you for that. In any case, so I'll start with an argument, and then I'm going to talk about some data and some descriptive examples, and then I want to return to the overarching argument and I want to pose some challenging questions that we'll talk about afterwards. So that's kind of the roadmap of where we're going. Oops, sorry. Okay. In my now not so recent book, New Jews, The End of the Jewish Diaspora, my co-author and I talked about globalization in the contemporary Jewish world, and the way that globalization is really changing the way that we think about traditional notions of diaspora and homeland. And I'm not going to summarize the entire book, I'm just going to say that the gist of that was to do three things. And I'll do three similar things, hopefully, in today's talk. One is to rethink the whole Jewish paradigm of center and periphery. And one of the things that I've noticed in participating in this colloquium as kind of an anthropological observer is that I've heard a lot of discourse about whether secular Jews are at the center or the margin. The whole counting question, how big are we, how small are we? And that implicitly, to me, is a similar way to think about the Jewish world of center and periphery, and I think it's problematic, frankly. The second thing that we try to do in New Jews is to challenge and dispel the notion that Jews who live in a global world already, such as Jews who live in, West Bloomfield Hills or Sydney or New York or Paris, Johannesburg, wherever, that we're somehow still in diaspora and we're not fully at home where we are. Whether or not anti-Semitism pervades our lives is a related issue, but I'm not going to cover that. And then the last thing that we tried to do in that book was to describe some of the ways that ordinary Jewish people around the world, whatever their denominational label or their beliefs, how are they living out their lives that in a sense that is simultaneously rooted in the communities in which they live and also connected to Jews around the world in this global kind of way, through Facebook, through travel, through museums and heritage tourism, all sorts of ways, through political activism, et cetera, et cetera. So today I want to build on that rubric of sort of 3 challenges to the way that people think about Jewishness and Jewish identity, not necessarily about Judaism, by the way, and I'll return to that in a second. But I want to, in a very preliminary way, with you as my guinea pigs, try out some ideas about who is a Jew, given that Jewish life is increasingly populated by people with identities and practices, again, not beliefs necessarily, that some people might castigate or dismiss as not quote-unquote Jewish enough, or just simply not Jewish. And I'm sure that people here who identify as secular humanists can probably relate to that feeling of, feeling marginalized or dismissed or castigated for what you believe or what you do or what you don't do and what you don't believe. So I want to argue that the diversity of identities and practices and also pathways to being Jewish and also to what in the sociological literature, which drives me crazy, doing Jewish. Have you ever heard that phrase? Doing Jewish. Oh, just amazing. Great. Anyway, what I want to say is that it represents not a glass half empty and slowly draining away. It's actually about the thriving of Jewish cultures and ideas and practices and democratic impulses that are both global and they're local in our own neighborhoods. So here, what I'm not going to talk about actually today is beliefs, which I mentioned, because as a sociologist I have to be quite candid with you. I really don't care what people believe. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. The whole conversation this morning about belief, I felt like, who cares? It's what you do. It's who you are. It's who you hang out with. It's where you give money. It's how you vote. It's what you do. It's about practice. And I teach primarily non-Jewish students at the University of Denver in Jewish studies classes, and they're always talking about, your faith and your belief. And I have to say over and over and over again that the essence of Jewishness, which is impossible to define because it's so slippery, is not about belief. And it is not about faith. It is about hanging out peoplehood. It is about collective belonging. It is about practice, or not. And it's about doing things with a sensibility, a particular cultural lens. At least that's my argument of Jewishness. And they're like looking at me totally blankly, what the heck are you talking about? That's okay. Colorado Springs is like just down the road, and that's why I get a lot of ways to talk. So here's my confessional moment. And I'm going to put my cards on the table very bluntly. I've got a lot of crap with the New Jews book and that argument that, you're arguing for the end of the Jewish people, not the end of diaspora. And actually, I want to say that I'm an optimist. And I think that it's not about glass half full or half empty. I think that it's about the cup overfloweth, to use a biblical metaphor. And there's all sorts of opportunities and challenges and risks with that overflowing. And I think that actually, that's a great thing, and there are lots of potential ways we can talk about later that secular humanistic Jews can seize the moment, so to speak, to reach people who might otherwise not pay attention to what you're about, in ways that are awesome and really fantastic if you think about it and if you do things, in a particular way that makes sense to those folks who you are otherwise not reaching, who are otherwise not in the room, who I'm going to talk about in a second. So that's kind of putting my cards on the table. And here's where I put on my activist hat and not my scholarly hat. In my work with Jewish Mosaic, I do a lot of consulting with Jewish organizations where they say, how can we be more inclusive of LGBT people? I'm like, have you looked at your website? Have you looked at your forms that say husband and wife? There are simple, easy things from an activist standpoint that require very little resources. I like to use Blue Greenberg, is that her name? Blue Greenberg, the Orthodox Jewish feminist. She was very famous for saying, there's a halachic will, there's a halachic way. If there's organizational will, because halacha here is not so important, if there's organizational will to become inclusive and embrace diversity, not just as a concept or an aspiration, but as embodied practice, then there's a way to do it. It's really not brain surgery. So now I'm going to turn to some examples of where I see some diversity in Jewish life and some trends. Okay, good. So,
Just say ding.
great. All right, so one trend is the idea that denominationalism is decreasing in its salience in Jewish life. In other words, post-denominationalism is a fact of Jewish life. And I'll read you this poster that I love. Jubu says, "Why kosher?" The answer, young grasshopper, is, everything tastes better with a shear. So I think what's happening in Jewish life is that people are picking and choosing in this very eclectic way how they want to engage with other Jews. P.S. It's usually not in a synagogue. And how they want to embrace their own identities is not tied to any particular denominational label or affiliation. And so I know, for example, somebody who identifies, I know lots of people in Boulder who identify as Jews or Buddhist Jews. And in fact, the action on Friday night Jewishly in Boulder is at the Shambhala Meditation Center, which is packed with Jews sitting on their Zafu meditation cushions, or at Neve Kodesh, which is a renewal synagogue founded by Tirza Firestone, a protege of Zalman Schachter Shalami, which they call themselves non-halachic neo-Hasidus. And they are dancing ecstatically until like midnight every Friday night, and sweaty and really happy, and they're doing all sorts of stuff. And the Shema there, they say the Shema, I kid you not, it lasts 10 minutes. And all of the people that I know who go to this particular synagogue in Boulder also maybe pray at an Orthodox synagogue, or maybe they don't go to synagogue at all except to go dance on Friday nights. They're dipping in where they choose and see fit, and they are not embracing any particular identity or label or denomination. They are certainly not paying synagogue dues. That's important to keep in mind. And they are not interested in calling themselves fill in the blank. And flexodox is a very popular term that I know amongst people in this sort of cohort. So that's one thing. Post-denominationalism is a fact of life, and then the flip side is that denominationalism is not salient for a huge number of American and North American Jews today. That's a lot to the Canadians. So, okay. Actually, I'm not on that yet, but that's okay. The other thing I want to do is talk a little bit about an important study that came out called Belonging Without Believing. Has anybody heard of that report? Nobody. You should all download it off the web, and I am happy to forward it. Belonging Without Believing. It's an analysis of data on Jews in the Pew Center's U.S. Religious Landscape Survey, and it was just released maybe like a year and a half ago by Professor Stephen Cohen and Lauren Blitzer. And what it does is it's taking that Pew data and it's analyzing the ways that Jews resemble and also depart or diverge from other major groupings of Christians in America, and also the religiously non-affiliated, in other words, the secular population, which they estimate is 16% of the Jewish population. So again, the numbers battle, how big are we, how small are we, who cares, but they basically argue that 16% of the American Jewish population is non-affiliated and secular. And what they found is that Jews score lower than Christians and look similar to non-affiliated secular people in terms of their belief. Oh, I am going to talk about belief. I didn't mean to. Basically, that they don't, like Jews in general do not hold theistic beliefs or believe in an afterlife or miracles. And Jews trail Christians in every single category in terms of religious behavior, in terms of prayer, services, reading the Bible, all sorts of stuff. And they more closely resemble ordinary secular Americans in what they do. However, here's the rub, and here's what's really interesting, and I think a potential opportunity for all of you as secular humanistic Jews. Jews belong to Jewish organizations and, surprisingly, to congregations without believing anything. And so that's the part of the collective peoplehood issue that I think is an opportunity for you to consider. How do you tap into that? Because tons of Jews that I'm sure you know in your own everyday lives and that I know belong to whatever, and we can define what that looks like, even if they have no belief. That's pretty interesting to me. What it also suggests is that Jewish organizations in general would do well by reaching to Jews through other symbols and channels and languages and modes of engagement that do not rely on religiosity. And here's where I'm going to talk about secular Jewish culture and why it's so sexy in a little bit. Many Jewish organizations, and I don't know about secular humanistic Jewish congregations, I'm kind of an observer here, but I think that a lot of Jewish organizations are their own worst enemy in terms of recognizing and reaching out to diverse groups of Jews who are already, not in pews, but already in their midst, and who also might walk through the doors, but need to be explicitly invited and said, yes, we're talking about you. Come. And people don't necessarily do that in any kind of articulate way. So here's a couple of examples about what I'm talking about in terms of diversity. Interfaith relationships are a fact of Jewish life. Duh! That whole controversy in the early 1990s from the National Jewish Population Survey, I can't tell you how many meetings I've gone to where that statistic is quoted incessantly and it's debated, and people do the Naomi Lewis hand-wringing of, oh my God, we're going to die. We're not going to die because we're marrying and coupling and having intimate relationships with non-Jews. When I said that at a meeting once, I just heard a pin drop. We're not going to die out simply because we are engaged in intimacy with non-Jews. I just don't believe it. The Jewish landscape in America is too varied and too interesting and too vibrant to warrant that conclusion based on what we're doing in our homes and our bedrooms and our lives and our relationships. So I see it as an opportunity, not as a cause for alarm. And then the debate becomes, in policy circles, well, okay, do they, also that language, do they need separate programming, like interfaith outreach for them because they have special needs, or should we just ignore that problem and define it as a problem and simply do what we always do and just have regular programming, and anybody is welcome through the door. I think characterizing the need out there and responses to that need as either outreach or mainstreaming is actually an erroneous way to conceptualize it, and it leads to bad policy decisions. And I can tell you why in a second. Okay, I'm going to give you a few snippets of data from recent studies that I think are interesting about interfaith relationships. In my city, I live in Denver, and there was a recent community study of roughly 82,000 Jews, and how you count who is a Jew was a huge controversy that took 6 months to define. Not surprising. What they found is that 53% of Jews are married to people who do not identify as Jewish. However, many of those people often participate in Jewish events, not necessarily congregations or synagogues, but they do Jewish stuff in the home and they do Jewish stuff out in the world. And Denver is not unusual. It compares roughly with San Francisco and with Atlanta. This doesn't include, by the way, none of the statistics I'm giving about interfaith relationships includes gay people. It simply does not, because gay people can't get married, and so therefore they're not counted in the way that demographers identify interfaith relationships. That's another story, don't get me started. Caryn Aviv, who's a sociologist here at the University of Michigan, she just published a book called Still Jewish, A History of Women and Intermarriage in America, and she suggests that Jews, particularly Jewish women, actually do not reject their Jewishness or their sense of belonging or their participation in organized Jewish life if and when they marry non-Jewish people. But a whole slew of recent communal research suggests that Jews who are in intimate relationships with non-Jews are far less likely to walk through any Jewish door of any Jewish organization if they perceive, rightly or wrongly, or if they fear that they will be rejected for their intimate choices. Why go and be hammered over the head with a guilt trip? Why go in the first place? So people just don't go. That's just food for thought. What else can I tell you? I'm going to turn the page. Thank you. Okay, so let's actually talk about young Jews. And let's look around the room for 1 second, not to hit you over the head or anything. But I'm 40, okay? And I think I'm the youngest person. One of the youngest people? You're 40. You're under 40. Woohoo! Okay. We've got, welcome to your minority status in Jewish life. So, where are all those young, groovy, hip Jews?
With their kids.
They're with their kids. Daycare, offering daycare at Jewish programming. Big plus. I will not be able to go to the Association for Jewish Studies annual meeting if it were not for daycare, period. I also have 2 other parents, which makes it much easier. But young Jews, it's not just about daycare, people. It's about the fact that young Jews are not really interested in synagogue life at all. And there was a recent Synagogue 3000 report that talked about synagogues that get it, that actually do some successful outreach to young Jews, meet those Jews where they are with programming that they're interested in, that they are invested in because they are planning the programming. They're the ones who are doing it. It's not people in their 50s and 60s who are planning singles events. Nobody's going to show up to a singles event. That sounds like meat market, and that sounds like your buddy setting you up with a dentist. Nobody's going to do it. So, having programming, cultural programming, i.e. not religious programming, and intellectual programming that meets their needs and their interests on their own terms, and I'm using their because I'm already old as a 4-year-old, that's really important. The other thing I want to mention is that there's a recent study that the Brandeis, I think it's called the Marilyn Morris Cone for Modern Jewish Studies, they've done a ton of analyses of Birthright alumni, Birthright Israel alumni. What happens when you go on this transformative 10-day trip and get really wasted and hook up with people on your bus, and then you come home and you're expected to are you expected to join a Jewish Federation board? Are you expected to become a major donor to the New Israel Fund? I don't think so. And so the question was, what happens to these folks, and do they participate in Jewish life? It's not surprising that the way that they framed their paper was tourists and travelers, not citizens. And so the suggestion or the argument is that people are not necessarily under 40, not necessarily ready for prime time to take the reins of major Jewish organizations and dive into organized communal life as full-fledged participatory citizens. They need some help along the way, or if you have that expectation that people are going to be major donors as soon as they get off the plane from Birthright, you're in for a real shock because people are interested in maybe connecting Jewishly once or twice a year. And P.S. again, it's not through going to synagogue, it's going to a Jewish film festival. Or it's going to Idan Rachel, which is a famous Israeli Idan Rachel project, a music band experience. Or they're interested in reading Haaretz.com once every couple months. Or hooking up with people on Facebook and communicating that way, but not necessarily doing anything identifiably Jewish out in the streets. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Where are the people under 40 in this room? They are not here, but there are reasons for that. And it's also, again, an opportunity, and it's a challenge. Okay, last group. Also, by the way, when I was preparing this talk, I'm I'm leaving out Russian Jews, I'm leaving out Jews of color. There are lots and lots of other groups that I could make similar arguments about and show that research, but I selected these 3 because these are the ones that I know the best. Okay, let's talk about me. No, I'm just kidding. Let's talk about LGBT Jews. So I've done 3 studies in the past year with Jewish Mosaic, collecting all sorts of qualitative and quantitative data. And one study I did with Stephen Cohen, we found that this is based on a national sample, and we're underestimating that 7% of the American Jewish population identifies as just lesbian or gay. Bisexual and transgender were not counted in that survey. So 7%. Keep in mind that I threw out a statistic earlier. 16% from the Pew survey showed that American Jews are non-believers, and this is 7% of American Jews. That's a lot of people, actually. I would say that 7% of the American Jewish people are probably more than the number of secular humanistic Jews who are identified as secular humanistic Judaism. Yes? Probably? Okay. What's also really interesting from these studies that we've done is that LGBT Jews overwhelmingly identify as secular. They are highly educated. They're far more likely to be involved with non-Jewish partners. So if you take the 53% average intermarriage rate and you add in queer people, it's going to bump up to 75. I'm just making that up, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's a small dating pool. And so what are you going to do? Okay. The other interesting thing is that they're less likely to belong to any congregation, any denomination. A lot of people that I've talked to in the course of my activist work have horror stories about hearing rabbis, up on the bima, comparing homosexuality to bestiality or pounding people on the head with Leviticus. And you hear that once, fine, you walk out. You hear that twice, you are masochistic. You hear that 3 times, you're stupid and you're like asking for it and you don't go back. And so that's why a lot of LGBT Jews that I know have not set foot in a synagogue in years and years and years. And they might be a member of a synagogue, it's the LGBT synagogue like in San Francisco, but they never go. But they go and they support, they support it through dues because they feel like they're supporting Jewish life somehow. It's kind of like people supporting Chabad telethons, even though they're not Chabad. I don't understand that. But what's also really interesting is that 39% of American Jews report belonging to synagogues. It is a tiny, maybe 16% of all of LGBT Jews that we've surveyed in all of these surveys. So that's really fascinating to me. However, we just did a national survey of rabbis, clergy and lay leaders in every single denomination in North America. It's called the Welcoming Synagogues Project, to do a baseline of how inclusive, how welcoming are synagogues in general? And does it vary from modern Orthodox to Reform to Reconstructionist? And the answer is obviously yes. What we found that shocked the pants off of me was that 58% of all rabbis, and that was a sample of 1,221 rabbis, so 58% of those rabbis said, oh, we have gay people in our synagogue. And I was like, really? Where are they? Because the people I talked to and the research I've done says the queer Jews are not in the pews, period. So there's a huge discrepancy between people's perceptions of how inclusive their congregations are and what LGBT Jews are actually doing. They're not showing up in synagogue. However, what's really also very interesting is here's again an opportunity. You want to make an organization or a synagogue or whatever more inclusive. LGBT Jews say they want to be involved in Jewish life. I would not be standing up here as a founder of Jewish Mosaic if I didn't want to be involved in Jewish life. People want to belong, but they also need to be invited. And if you extend that invitation explicitly, articulately, visually, again and again and again, maybe people will see it and maybe they'll walk through your doors. I have no guarantees. So what does all of this mean? What I've heard, again, kind of to return to the beginning of the argument, is that how big are we? How small are we? Are we on the margins? Are we in the center? Are we the mass of most American Jews? Are we a tiny little minority fringe that nobody pays attention to? And damn it, pay attention to us? That's an interesting conversation. And what I'm suggesting here is that from this research, there might be more people out there than you think who are really receptive to the ideas of secular humanistic Judaism, but they're not going to walk through the doors of a synagogue, because that's not really where people are at. And I think Jacques really described something very important last night, that there's secular with a capital S that has to do with disestablishment issues, and then there's secular with a small s. And I'm talking about the vast number of American Jews who are secular with a small s. Synagogue congregational life is not compelling as a way to engage Jewishly. That's just the way it is. So then what do you do? Okay, so what do you do? All of this leads to what I call not the rise, it's like the idea that secular Jewish culture, despite the moaning and groaning about no Jews in the pews of secular humanistic Jewish congregations, secular Jewish culture is super sexy. And people are funding it. They're just funding it in different ways than a congregational sort of effort. Congregations as institutions are not sexy, period. They're just not sexy, especially to young Jews, especially to LGBT Jews, especially to interfaith couples. I don't know if you know any of these organizations. I won't go into great detail about who they are, but suffice to say that Zeke at juicy.com, Zeke is a really interesting intellectual journal that was started by Jay Michelson, who's actually very, very spiritual, and just published a book on non-dual Judaism called Everything is God. And funny that I'm here at a secular humanistic Judaism conference today, and on Thursday I'll be at a spiritual Woodstock in New York, talking about how secular and spiritual Jewish culture can meet in the same room and connect and collaborate and do fun stuff. Tablet is a project of Next Book. I don't know if you know about it, but it's a really interesting website. Very intellectual, very cultural, very cutting edge, really interesting stuff. Chazon, so here's a really good example of where there's an opportunity for secular humanistic Jews to do good work. Hello, social justice movement organizing. That's like such a ripe opportunity to galvanize and mobilize and collectively organize secular Jews who want to do something that might be Jewish, but they definitely want to do it with other Jews. And so Chazon is a really interesting, relatively new-ish organization that works on social justice, environmental issues in the Jewish community and in the wider world. They have a food conference, they're organizing community-supported agriculture, shares in the Jewish community across the country. They're mobilizing people on bike tours to understand environmental issues in Israel and in the United States. That's a really great way that people could partner with a particular organization that's focused on a set of issues that appeal to secular Jews. Center for Cultural Judaism and Poston Foundation, hello, they fund my salary, and Progressive Jewish Alliance, which is organizing the Jewish community around issues like workers' rights, immigration reform, border issues, economic justice, and poverty. They're all relevant, important issues, and secular Jews have a long tradition and a rich history and a very sophisticated vocabulary, conceptual vocabulary, to do those kinds of things that are both Jewish and secular and oriented to tikkun olam, to repairing the world. That's an opportunity. What else can I tell you? Okay, so the last thing. Okay. This is my favorite. You say that life is suffering, but isn't it also about complaining? At a Boo Jew retreat run by Sylvia Borstein. So I want to end with this cartoon that I have to say, I opened up the New Yorker and I saw this on a plane, and I laughed so hard that I woke up the person sitting next to me because I thought, oh my God, this is so Jewish. This is perfect. I want to send this to everybody I know because I think what often happens, to return to the metaphor, glass half empty, glass half full, is that there's a lot of complaining that happens in Jewish communities, organizations, policy circles, research think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. We are very good at complaining, like we're very good at being pushy. And I think there's room for complaining, that's fine, but there's also room for envisioning and for brainstorming and for action. You can tell I'm an activist, also a scholar. There's room for embracing diversity and getting with the program and doing something about it besides talking, besides complaining. So that's my challenge for you, is a couple of questions, which is, can we, as Jews, acknowledge and sit with our own discomfort around diversity issues so that we can listen harder to what people are saying when they don't walk through our doors? Can we be more compassionate about the people who might have experienced alienation and marginalization in Jewish life, rather than simply complain about the people who are not here, and complain about all the change in Jewish life, or worse, even worse, reject people outright as crazy or evangelical or fundamentalist or whatever you want to say, and that's really easy to do. It's also the cheap way out. The last thing that I want to end with is a plea that, can we acknowledge diversity in our own communities as a blessing and not as a threat to our own existence? We're not going to die just because we're changing. Can we think of creative ways to grow our own organizations and take risks to partner with others and support potential and emerging leaders? Here's where the collaboration and the coalition building comes in, and grow our leaders so that we can have relationships and build strength in numbers, and think outside of the box to reach people that would otherwise never, never walk through the doors of a congregation like Birmingham Temple. Those people are out there. You can meet them. You just have to meet them where they are. And the last question is, what kind of Jewish future do we want to pass on to our kids? So Ron this morning talked a lot about legacy and thinking about death, and that the frame around death is also thinking about life. and I was very moved by that. You know, can we embrace rather than avoid? Can we include rather than reject the diversity that already exists among us? So that we can have more choices of how we want to be Jewish in a world that, at this point, needs a whole lot of repair, a whole lot of healing. And are we up to that task? I don't have the answers, I just have suggestions and provocations. Thank you.